And I know we're going to have a few more folks that start to trickle in, but in the meantime, I'd love to get this kicked off. We've got an hour and 15 minutes for our chat today, and I don't want to waste a minute of it. And so, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session on election readiness today. The panel is joining you from Ottawa and the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We recognize the Algonquin as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. Before I introduce you to the brilliant minds that join us today, thank you to Canadian Food Grains Bank for sponsoring the translation for this session. You can listen in French or English by selecting your preferred option at the bottom of the screen. Election readiness is a topic near and dear to my heart. Before taking on the role of campaign director for ODA advocacy, I worked with the provincial and federal government and have seen firsthand the impact that citizens can have in an election. Joining me today are I'm also admitting folks from the waiting room, are three people who share that belief. Not only that our campaigns are important, but there's also a potential to drive real change during them. Scott Thurlow is Vice President with Temple Scott and Associates and has over 20 years of government relations experience as an executive, consultant, lobbyist, and lawyer. He provides advice and opinions on the law surrounding lobbying and elections. From Crestview Strategy, Jackie Choquette is Vice President and Interim Practice Lead Government Relations. With nearly 20 years of public affairs experience, she has worked with governments of all levels across Canada, giving her all the skills necessary to navigate the complex machinery of government and influence decision makers. Finally, Lindsay Sheridan joins us from Results Canada, where she is focused on creating the political will to end extreme poverty. She engages regularly with parliamentarians and provides support to a growing volunteer network who are taking action to leverage critical high-impact investments and policy in global health, education, and economic inclusion. I hope you all take a moment with me to welcome this incredible group to the virtual stage. But with no further ado, let's get our discussion started. We're eager to hear your thoughts, reflections, and questions, so don't hesitate to join us in the chat or raise a hand to ask your question live. To get things kicked off, I have a few of my own. I'm going to start broad with a question that I know everyone on this panel has an opinion. Do campaigns matter, and when should you start getting organized? And I see Jackie at the top of my screen, so I'm going to throw her into the hot seat first.
Yes, and immediately. That's the shortest answer I can give you. Campaigns absolutely matter. We've seen, and I will get into many discussions and examples throughout our brief time today, but there's no shortage of examples where campaigns and politicians have shifted, things have happened on the ground. How many times has a campaign started where you think one party is the clear winner and 38 short days later, you're very surprised at the outcome. So no doubt campaigns matter. When the question about when to start, now is a great time. Federally, the campaign is looking highly probable for this fall. Of course, there's no certainty in our world, but if I were a betting lady, I would put a lot of money on a campaign this fall. And so that makes this summer what is coveted as the highly important pre-writ period, where campaigns are really starting to formulate things like their platform, all of their communications plans and rollouts, their events. They're really starting to pinpoint how they feel about certain issues and what they'll say about those issues. So now is the time to get in on the ground floor and influence what some of those will be. And I won't take too much time because I know we'll unpack what that means throughout the discussion today.
Lindsay, did you want to hop in with some thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that it's also really important in terms of having a unified and collective front to be able to all be kind of saying similar messaging so that it catches on, so that becomes a priority, so that people are hearing what you're saying and what you care about and what issues matter to Canadians. So being coordinated is really crucial in terms of the campaign perspective, and just echoing what Jackie said, the sooner you start, the more you can elevate your issues and the more you can engage in deeper tactics that will help you achieve the goal you want.
Thank you. Scott, do you want to hop in with some high-level thoughts off the top?
Sure, and I will take Jackie's bet with odds. I'm probably the only person in Canada who doesn't think we're going to have an election this fall. I think a good starting point might be, say, I don't know, the appointment of a governor general, which we still don't have. Anyway, that having been said, there are a lot of political things you can do, and there's a lot of legal things that you can do. And I am going to give you a very quick overview of some of the legal responsibilities that can flow from your activities. Now, this doesn't mean don't go campaign. This doesn't mean don't put up a website. It means if you are going to spend money during the election, you are going to create some legal obligations on yourself. Now, for Jackie and I, we just go pound on doors. We knock on doors. We don't take out multi-million-dollar campaigns. And Doug Ford is the kind of person that would just make that illegal anyway. So in Ontario, we've seen judicial action in this space, and as a result, a constitutional debate arose in the legislature. But in for a federal election, we do have what are known as third-party registration laws. Now, there are two key questions that you have to remind yourself. If you're paying for advocacy and your goal is to influence voters, then you are registrable as a third party. But if you're trying to affect the campaigns, you're not a third party. And it's an important distinction. Okay. Now, there's a difference between paying into the earned media strata to influence the coverage of media and campaigns. And then there's paying for volunteers and buying food and contributing office space. The latter falls into what's known as a partisan activity. It's a donation in kind. And so there are very set limits on those types of things. And there are rules that are set up to focus on how people try to circumvent these rules. So again, I don't know, what everyone's means are here, but there is a maximum allowable amount of just over 500,000. But if you combined many of these groups, you can see an echo effect from that 500,000. And so there is a very specific rule that's designed to prevent that kind of corralling of funds. And just so everyone's knowing, don't take notes. I'm going to send a little presentation to Sarah later that she can send through to everyone here. But it's really about understanding what those triggers are. Okay, so the triggers are partisan activity. Are you trying to help someone get elected, or as I like to say, help someone get unelected, right? Are you voting for, are you trying to vote for someone or vote against someone? Now, there are different ways of doing this. So if Jackie and I and Lindsay got together and said, we really want to defeat the current member of parliament in Ottawa South for whatever reason, we would never do that, of course. That's absolutely antithetical to our raison d'etre. But we could frame it as that, but we could also frame it as we support candidate X. Okay, so it's both a positive and a negative opportunity and obligation. Okay, so these are the three key things. Who are you trying to influence? Is it partisan? And in the event that it is both, you're trying to influence the electors and it is partisan, it's something that has a fixed limit on it. Now, you can go really small, Ottawa South, or you can go really big, okay, which is the entire country. And then the other kind of caveat I would have on the partisan activity, and I'm happy to get back into this a little bit later, is if it's issue specific and that issue is tied closely to the position of a candidate or a party, or opposed to a candidate or a party, that will also trigger the third party obligation. So just by way of example only, if the issue is free trade, okay, there are some parties that are more known for free trade, and there are some parties that are more known for not being supportive of free trade. So be very cognizant about what the purpose of your advocacy and work is, and know that it could, even though it's an issue near and dear to your heart, it could also align with a partisan platform, and that would also trigger the obligation. Anyway, that was a very long rant. All of these things are things that have chapters of the Canada Elections Act dedicated to them. So as you have questions, please do let me know. One of the things I will be very clear about, though, third parties can include corporations. They can include unions. They can include an association of three people who just threw all their money into a hat. It's basically anything that isn't an electoral actor. Candidate, political party, okay? And just to be clear, it can include corporations. So when you hear people say, oh, corporations can't participate in Canadian elections, that's not true. They just can't donate directly to parties. Okay, they're also not supposed to align their campaigns with those of the political actors. And there are exactly 0 examples of this in Canadian history where that has happened. It's just very, very difficult to prove. So be mindful of those things. And then the last thing is, if the money comes from outside of Canada, that is an absolute no-no, and it leads to jail time. Okay, like it is punishable under the act with time in the big house. So I will pause there and pass it over to the discussion. And I apologize if I'm cutting in and out a little bit. I have a 3 o'clock call that is set in stone every week forever. So I'm going to be trying to listen to both at the same time.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm going to keep you in the hot seat just for 2 more quick questions. One being, you mentioned specifically corporations. We have a lot of charities in the sector. If there are any specific flags for charities. And I was wondering if you could give us a couple examples of what would be considered an activity that wouldn't require you to jump through any hoops. It's not a third-party activity. It's just sort of you engaging as a private citizen. Yeah, if you could just unpack those quickly, because I do know that you're going to be split focused any second now.
Absolutely. So charities are effectively, for the purposes of the Canada Elections Act, the same as corporations and unions. You have other obligations as charities, though, your PIT obligations, which will inform the purpose of your charity. So be very careful that you don't create any obligations that may lead to a deregistration of your charity. I would very strongly urge against that. As you know, that there's been some changes to the charitable rules since what I'll say the return of Prime Minister Trudeau. And so some of the changes from the previous government were reversed, but that does not mean that charities can be open political actors. And so it's a different set of Canada Revenue Agency's laws that are going to apply to the raison d'etre for the committees, or for the charities. However, they can still participate in the process. Now, some examples of things that absolutely do not count as third-party advertising. Okay, sending out an email to all of your members, putting up a Facebook post that says, we like policy X, Y, or Z, volunteering your own individual time. Now, 2 huge caveats. If you use money to promote that Facebook ad, and you use that Facebook ad to drive an outcome, that will absolutely trigger third-party registration. And there are all kinds of bizarre and Byzantine little rules about how those ads are targeted and what those targeted ads can really mean. And we all know they're hyper effective because your iPhone is always listening to you, right? So I always get ads for things that I want because I know that all of my computer programs are intertwined with one another. The other thing that I would very quickly say is that earned media is not third-party activity. So if you put out a press release that says, Jackie Shuckett, leader of charity number 11, say the best thing that we could do is have this public policy, and every newspaper in the country covers it, and you don't spend a dime, you are not a third-party actor. It's when you start promoting that message that you are participating in truly partisan and beneficial activity. I mean, it's a little bit silly, but the logic behind it is that the media are somehow above the political fray and that they get to decide what is or is not newsworthy. As someone who's been a partisan political actor for 25 years, that's poppycock. We all know that they have their own agendas from time to time, but they are very specifically insulated from the act. Okay, so that earned media does not count.
Thank you so much, Scott. That's fantastic. I'm going to pop over to Jackie. My question is just around all of the noise that comes around elections. There's so much information. It's coming from different sources, just bombarding people every day. Do you have any advice on the best way to sort of cut through that noise and sort of define opportunities and moments that can really help your message resonate?
Oh, sure. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I'll just say by way of introduction to that. So campaigns matter, I think, in large part because citizens are hyper-focused and involved in campaigns during the writ period. And I have been active in politics for a long time. I worked in government for way too long. And it always broke my heart to realize that I was doing a good job in government when most people never thought about it. And so the reality is most Canadians would love, and by most, I don't mean the group that's on the call right now because you're active and engaged and involved in the issues, but the vast majority of Canadians would love to go about their lives every single day and not think about the government once. They would consider that a success. But during a campaign, all of those eyeballs and all that attention is back focused on not just the government, but the potential governments in waiting and all of the other parties who are vying for your support and vote. So people really start to unpack the issues. And as a result, a lot of issues are talked about. There is a tremendous amount of information that gets thrown about, and some people do feel overwhelmed. So there's a whole science, and certainly, I mean, I work for a firm that makes a good living out of helping people to cut through the noise. I think there's a few things that you should keep in mind as some general rules by which to focus some of your efforts. The first is think carefully about who your audience is. So you really want to be trying to target people who have a natural interest or alignment with your issue set, maybe people who have been involved or engaged before. So that could be donors, it could be volunteers, it could be people within your network. So your employees and the friends and family of those employees, people who are naturally interested or have some sort of personal stake in the industry or the issues. And then think about how you're speaking to those people. So trying to tailor messages and content really in a package that is easy for them to consume in a way they want to consume it. So the best example I will give you is, I'm from a certain generation where I still love paper. I like to read the newspaper in paper format. I like magazines. When I get flyers at my door, I pick them up, I look at them and I read them. There's a lot of people who aren't like that anymore. There's a lot of people I work with, younger people in my office who would never look at a piece of paper, haven't actually touched paper. They consume everything digitally. And if it's not through their Facebook or through their TikTok or through Twitter, then it wouldn't necessarily resonate with them. So really understanding who you're speaking to, what they're most interested in, and where they're most likely to consume their information is probably the easiest to be able to cut through the noise. And then the last piece, and this is sort of the harder kind of magic, no pressure, is finding ways to make your message interesting, compelling. You want to, where possible, play on people's emotional threads and strike a chord with them inside, whether it's appealing to their better selves or their higher values. How do you motivate and inspire people? Or anger them, quite frankly, during campaigns is also a tactic. How do you get people really upset? How do you make them feel threatened that they're about to lose something that's really important to them? So thinking carefully about how to elicit that sort of emotional response, one way or the other.
Thank you. Robin, Becca, I see your questions in the chat. I'm going to loop back on partisanship in just 1 minute. I just have one quick question for Lindsay. I'm sorry, this is my prerogative as moderator. I get to bounce around. But so Lindsay, we've heard that engaging with candidates during an election is key, but how do you make sure that people are actually prepared to take that on? I know at Results, you've done a lot of work around this. So what sort of tools have you found really effective in preparing volunteers or supporters, either when they're reaching out to candidates in the writ or when they're talking to MPs outside of it?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here today talking about election readiness and just demystifying some of the election process, because at the end of the day, we do have a lot of power and we do have a lot of privilege to participate in a democracy and to vote. And so I think it's really important to recognize that actions and tactics you can take as an individual that could help some of the things that Jackie just mentioned, elicit those responses or being engaged. So just one thing quickly about candidates, and I think it's important, and everybody can do this now, and I challenge you to start thinking about it with an election looming potentially, is just what are the 3 main issues that you care about in your community or that are really important to you? And just having an idea in your mind on how you would articulate that to someone in a succinct way, because you do never know when you're going to get a cold call, when someone's going to knock on your door, when an opportunity arises to share those issues. And so I think it's important to at least have an idea in your mind on how you would present that in an effective way. And then at Results, we do a lot of engagement with decision makers through our volunteers. And I think it's really important to be informed in kind of exactly what Jackie said. You want to know what your inroads are. You want to know where there could be some potential planks in the road. And you want to be prepared to speak to the people you're talking to. So a lot of times it's just having conversations too, building confidence, letting people know that and feeling empowered that they can take action and that it does matter and that it is important that they're engaging, not only in an election period, but also with their decision maker. Because if you're not bringing up your issues, they might not get presented in any way. And if you're not talking about it, somebody else might not either. So it's really in your prerogative and should be important to you that your potential candidates and elected officials know what you care about. So in regards to tools, we have a lot of different tools, how to communicate effectively. There's a lot of ways to just sort out how you want to engage. I think one of the main differences versus engaging with MPs right now versus an election is a call to action. Always making sure when you're engaging with a member of parliament that you are asking them to take action on the issue you care about if they agree or are on board with what you're talking about. And then in terms of whenever an election is happening, is being informed and understanding where all the candidates lie in terms of policies and understanding. So you can ask them questions if you need clarification, or you can kind of see and create that space to maybe elicit a certain response or say, hey, you don't really have a lot on this issue. I really care about it. And bringing that up in political fora and the community events is really crucial, because then it gets your kind of issue to the top of the community space and at least has people thinking about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay. So Scott, I'm not sure if you are able to pop back on camera. We've got a few questions that have come in around partisanship and spending. And so if you're still detained, leave your camera off and I will come back to you. Message received. So Lindsay, I'm just going to ask, do you mind unpacking a little bit more what some of those sort of discussion pieces look like when you're really going into conversations with candidates and sort of unpacking those issues? Jackie brought up sort of the pulling at people's heartstrings. And so what's your experience sort of dovetailing those emotional messages with broader issues?
Yeah, so one of the things I think people don't realize, and I think it's really important, is attaching your issue to something that you personally care about and are passionate about and have experience in, because that's really what's going to make a mark and leave a lasting impression. Oftentimes people think you need to be really formal engaging with politicians. When I find speaking from the heart, bringing up examples in your community, that's also really crucial too. Almost all the candidates are going to live where you live. They're going to go to the same grocery stores. They're going to know those spaces. So using those, and then if we're talking about global cooperation and solidarity, connecting maybe your experience with how that is happening around the world and why it's so important that Canada steps up, making sure you're trying to engage in, maybe you read something on Twitter that the MP said. And so bringing that too shows the candidate or MP that you are paying attention to them too. And that's really critical as well. And I think it's just finding the moments where you can spread your message is really important. So whether it's writing a letter to the editor, earned media, bringing it up in the space, having people have a conversation is really crucial. Because at the end of the day, one of these candidates is inevitably going to be elected. So if you've been able to engage and touch on their heartstrings or been able to interact with them in one way, when they do come to Parliament, you kind of have that foundation to build the relationship from there and say, hey, I was engaged in the election. I talked to everybody. I want to further this conversation now. So you really have to see it as relationship building. And I think you really need to pull on the things that you're passionate about, because that's often what I find comes out the strongest. That's what affects people the most. It's the most memorable, especially when you do have that community connection. I think it's key.
Totally. Can I add one point to that? I agree wholeheartedly with everything you just said. And I just want to underscore, people often get intimidated about participating in campaigns. It can be scary. It can be overwhelming if you've never done it before. Seems like a lot of pressure to talk to a candidate or go to a candidates meeting and ask a question. Don't be afraid to start small. And realize the power that you have on the lives of everyone around you. So one of the biggest influencers and indicator for how somebody will vote or if they will vote are their family and peer networks. And so even if you made it a promise to yourself and a commitment that during the next election, you will talk to everybody in your life about the issues, make them understand the issues that matter to you, why they matter to you, and how to best vote to ensure that those issues are properly addressed or advanced on an international or domestic level. That is remarkably powerful. So don't be shy about sharing your experiences and your views with the people in your life. Sometimes we forget to talk to the people closest to us about that. We also had a saying in politics, and that is don't ever vote alone. So when you go vote, please bring at least one other person with you, because the single greatest way to influence the impact of an outcome is to vote, really.
Yeah, and I can even tack onto that too, because I think it's so important, and to reiterate over and over again, any action is a starting point, and any action can lead to something else that you have no idea or the consequences of what it'll unfold to. And so it results, even just pressing send on an email, on an LTE, on a letter to somebody, that's taking action, and you should really not only feel good about it, but feel like that is the jumping off point to doing other stuff. It could be posting one question in a Facebook forum that candidate has, and that could launch a whole conversation on the issue you care about. And so I really emphasize taking action as little as it can be. Obviously, voting is at the end of the day crucial, but all those other little things you can build up to, and every action does matter, I think, if you're passionate and care about whatever issues you want to see addressed.
Absolutely. Scott, I saw you come off mute. Well, maybe not. We did have a question come up that was unpacking what we were just chatting about. In the morning direction and control events, one of the senators that was presenting directed us to work to get our issues into the respective party platforms. So the question is, this issue lacks connectivity, especially with the current government. Do you have any advice for us?
What do you mean by connectivity?
John, did you want to hop in and provide a little bit of backstory?
Yeah, for those that weren't maybe part of the session this morning, this is all to do with direction and control, and a specific part of the Income Tax Act that we're working to change. The Conservative Party, the NDP, at very high levels have indicated that they're supportive of this change. The Liberal Party has been for whatever reason, not engaged with this issue, or seemingly unapproachable, or even Senator Ahmedvar has failed to connect with the Minister of National Revenue. So even she has difficulties as a senator in working on this. But we definitely, if we want to move on this, we have to bring along the current government on this issue. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that the most powerful way to do that is to try and recruit and groom some caucus champions. So if you can find one or two MPs within the fold who believe in it strongly, and can help push from the inside, that's really effective. MPs become more and more sensitive and attuned to specific issues during periods. Like they're looking to align with their voters as well. So start with the MPs that you have some sort of connection with, like a footprint in their riding, or MPs that have a background or interest in your specific sector, or with this specific piece.
Lindsay,
and then,
sorry, continue.
Not to get hyper political, but if the Liberals won't agree to it, and you can get the opposition to ask for it and to push for it and ask for it in a very public way during a campaign, that also has the effect of helping to push parties to change their mind on certain things.
Absolutely. I was going to throw Lindsay in the hot seat as well, just to see if you've got any practical examples sort of through your own outreach to caucus. I know that this has been a big issue for the sector for a while. If there's anything that's come up through your world.
I won't say not necessarily in this specific issue, because I think, as John said, it is one of those ones that's been hard, and a lot of people have been advocating for it. But I think one of the things is continuing to maintain momentum around it too, and not really letting up at any time. I think especially with this piece, we've seen a different couple of things come up. We've had some wins, and I think it's really important to build and put pressure continuously into this kind of period. And I would just echo what Jackie said about having some inner champions or inner voices who are really going to help make the difference and push it up, or at least explain why it's important. And I think sometimes that's where a lot of things get missing in translation, and especially this issue. I think it's really important that people understand, and especially educating MPs is crucial. Half the time they work on so many issues, they might not have a deeper understanding of what you're talking about too. So providing that education piece is also really crucial, especially if you're in the party where you're maybe not getting as much traction.
Thank you so much. So I know that we haven't been able to touch on a couple of the regulatory questions that have come in. I just want to mention two things off the top. We're going to be doing some deeper dive webinars on this piece that are going to happen throughout the summer. Yeah, I know that Scott will be able to pop back in at some point, and we'll be able to dive into these a little bit more. And John, I am just responding to your question about Terry privately as well. Absolutely. So is there anyone else in our audience? We've got a fantastic 83 person group that are with us today. Any other questions that are top of mind for all of you as you're either thinking through what your election planning could be, or if you have deeper concerns about impacts or those sorts of different pieces that need to come together? Nick, I see your hand up.
Yes, hi. Hi everyone, it's great to see you. You know, we heard just earlier many of the constraints that there are to operating an election, but we do have a lot of registered charities on the call, and frankly, we're a sector that can often be risk averse about some of the sort of legislative constraints around engaging in elections. I wonder if you could maybe just give us a sense of what is possible. Within the constraints, are we still encouraging action, and what does that look like? Would really like to get a sense from you on that. Just maybe a counterweight to, when we go and ask lawyers what we should do, I think we'll ultimately be told, don't do much. But I know that's not the case. I know there's a lot that we can do. So maybe giving us a sense of the what is possible.
Sure, that's a great question, because there's so much that is possible during an election. And I think, as Scott mentioned, the rules around third-party engagement are really when you spend money to influence voters. And that's a very specific piece. But there are lots of things. So I'll give you some concrete examples. If you wanted to send a weekly newsletter to your mailing list with an update from the campaign trail, here's where all of the major parties stand, these are the big issues from the week, perfectly allowed. If you wanted to post on Facebook messages that are in support or furthering the discussion in and around things that are happening, that's completely within your realm. You can issue press releases. You can develop questionnaires. Here's a popular one. You can develop questionnaires for local candidates that you send to them and ask them to fill out to get their opinion or feedback on certain policies or initiatives. You can participate in campaigns, so you can volunteer your time to go door knock, make phone calls, drop literature, put up lawn signs, anything like that. As number one, individuals, and number two, organizations have protected civil liberties in this country to participate in the election process. You're allowed to have an opinion, you're allowed to be part of it. It's really when the exchange of money and influence is sort of, I think, the easiest way. When you're spending money to get specific outcomes, that's when you have to pause and talk to the lawyers about what your obligations are. Up and until that point, anything you can do within your existing resources is fine. I want to add to, someone in the chat asked if it was partisan, if you're asking the same thing from all parties. Absolutely not. That's preserving your self-interest and advocating for the issues that matter for you. And I think that's probably the best way for everyone on this call to approach it. There's no need for you to get partisan or political. Really, you're out to advocate for the sector and for the greater good. And your job is to find any party or any ally really that will align with your priorities and talk about and support your issues the way that you do. So I would actually say there's no benefit. I'm on the record. There's no benefit to you being partisan or political. Talk about your issues and get the support wherever you can get it from.
And I can quickly add something, just working in from the sector lens, and something I think is all really important that we oftentimes don't take advantages of is that exactly we are all individual citizens who are able to participate. And so even in this call right now, there's potentially 80 voters in Canada who can do all of these actions and take these steps from their private idea and to make those known. And you are an expert, and many of you are experts in the spaces. And so use that to advantage and engage when you can. I think it's really crucial. I think we need to harness the power we have individually and not only empower and mobilize and inspire the people in our networks and the people on our mailing lists, because oftentimes, and I think we've touched on it before, people don't know how to get started or people don't know what they can and cannot do. And so I think the absolute worst thing is to do nothing. And so you can take steps, you can do things. And I think it's really important that we just start thinking, what can you do individually? What can we do together? And how can we continue to push, especially with this election and pandemic, the important things we care about in terms of the global recovery and in terms of just global solidarity.
Robin, I see your hand up. I just want to go to one question in the chat and then we'll go to you if that's okay. So the question is, we're basically in limbo knowing there's likely going to be an election call. Would folks say that we continue with business as usual, lobbying and outreach, and while working behind the scenes on election materials? What would you recommend?
Yes, so I would recommend continue with your work. You have to presume as if there isn't an election. And in fact, knowing that there could be an election this fall would create urgency in some of your work. So if you're actively engaged with the government on certain files, you want to push them to wrap up as much of their policy or other initiatives, programming decisions that need to be made. You want those decisions to be made this summer, just in case. And if I'm wrong, great, then you have new projects for the fall. But that way you're inoculated. And the other thing I would add is if it's not already, you should increase your outreach to opposition members. Make sure that they're educated on your issues and your asks. Make sure that they know, get their feedback and support. You never know, campaigns are like playoffs. You never know what's going to happen. So you want to make sure that you have mitigated all your risks and you're well covered regardless of what the outcome of the election is. Lindsay might have other opinions on that as well.
No, I was going to say in this one, I agree. I think it's almost even more urgent right now, thinking that there is an election. And I mean, if there isn't, we're going to continue on as usual. But there are a lot of things we want to see happen before an election happens. And so right now, it's some of those critical moments. And so it's important to balance both the continuation of everything we're asking for and the policies we're doing now, while also thinking in the back of our minds, okay, what is the strategy? How are we going to pivot when the writ is dropped and when an election is called? And so I think it's always just about in your mind, having an idea and a game plan and being connected and collaborating with those around you to at least feel confident that you could have a really clear-cut message when the election does happen.
Absolutely. Robin, we'll go to you.
Great, thanks everyone. That last question just stimulated another question from me. I'm actually kind of curious, can you speak a little bit to how an election being called actually might impact some of our ongoing works and some concrete examples of what could happen to some of those work streams? And then I'd love to hear from our sector allies, what ways have we kind of collaborated or worked in coalition in the lead up to an election in the past, just to give us some of those examples. And then lastly, as an individual, what can we do? So I remember last election, I went to like a all candidate kind of question period in my community, asked a question about ODA as an individual, not with my organizational hat on, but just as an interested individual. What are the other ways that me as an individual can kind of take those actions during the election campaign?
It's a really great question. I'll start with the what happens now because it is timely. So right now the government is operating as usual. The House of Commons obviously wraps up this week. And so the work you're doing with departments will continue. If you're thinking about a potential campaign this fall, that would mean that the final cabinet meeting and the final Treasury Board meetings are likely to happen sometime in early August at the latest. And that's a key moment because that's essentially the last decision point where the government can sign off on things. And during a campaign, the government goes into caretaker mode. So what this means is public public servants within the departments are continuing to operate and run programs that have already been approved and that are in the works, but they can't make any new decisions. So, good example, if you have a funding request in with government and you're awaiting decisions, you'll want that decision now for Treasury Board approval by the end of July, because once you're in a campaign period, that funding decision will be put on hold until the government is back. Also keep in mind that there's the campaign period, and then once the campaign is done, it will likely take a few weeks until a cabinet is named and sworn in, because members, also MPs, have to be sworn in. And so the caretaker mode really goes for anywhere from 4 to 6 to maybe even 8 weeks after the writ period is ended. So it's a significant chunk of time. So no new decisions is the short answer. But any work that you do with departments on existing programs or policies will continue and can continue. I'm often surprised at how much latitude our public servants have to act when they've been empowered. So as long as the structure is in place, the regs or the legislation or the program is in place with clear direction on what they should do, they can do it. They just can't make any new decisions. So it's status quo. And then I'll let Lindsay chime in on the coalition piece really quickly on the what you can do as an individual. You gave a great example of going to an all candidates meeting, asking a question. That's really important. You can write your candidates as well. You can email or write them asking for their feedback. You can, this is going to date me when I say you can write a letter to the editor for your local paper newspaper. Remember that you would read in the morning with coffee. But a lot of that happens online. There's very active forums online, so you can comment on news media online, and there's a lot of online chats and forums where people share ideas and ask questions, and you can participate in those. It's really important. And again, I can't say enough, the single most important thing you can do is talk to the people in your life about the campaign, about the issues that matter to them. Vote yourself and encourage those people to vote with you. And Lindsay will talk about coalition stuff.
Yeah, I was gonna say LTE's letters to the editor at Results Canada. We love letters to the editor. It's a short thing you can do. It's in your community. There's a diverse audience who reads those, so it's really important. It's a quick action you can kind of start to do. So definitely recommend letters to the editor. Just building off that, another thing that Results volunteers have been empowered and have success with in the past has been scheduling meetings with their candidates if it works out. And so we're really lucky at Results. We have volunteers that are in groups in different constituencies, and so they'll invite their candidate and have a conversation with them and ask questions and really have an understanding and a connection moment with their candidate. So if that's possible and you have the time to kind of arrange that, that's something you can do as well. I know in the past, I have not been around as much in the sector because I was on the Hill prior to this, but I know in terms of coalition work, the last election, we did see a 25% cut up on the docket. And I think one of the things that many people have said and heard is just reacting to that. And so I think moving forward, we all know that we do have to have some reactions, especially in terms to the work we're doing. So I think really important in coalition that we all kind of have reactions that are kind of similar, messaging that's kind of similar, or at least we all have an understanding of where that's going to go, because a unified voice can make a real difference in terms of building I guess, a narrative and an idea around something to get people excited about and to become like a priority issue.
Awesome. Elise, I see your hand. I'm just going to go to one quick question in the chat and then we'll be over to you. So when emailing MPs or political stakeholders about election platforms, can you contact them through their parle.gc.ca accounts, or do you need to reach out through unofficial channels? What political business can be done using government accounts? And I might throw that one over to Jackie.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think we have to be clear about what our definition of political business is. So if you're contacting an MP to talk to them about an issue on behalf of your organization, funding, policy, government programs and support, that's not political, that's public policy. That's an important role that the government plays, and you would absolutely use their parliamentary email for that. When we talk political, the only time they can't use their parliamentary email for political, it's partisan politics. So for example, an MP can't use their parliamentary email account to email me and ask me to donate to the Liberal Party of Canada. That would be contrary to the rules. They can't use their account to email me and ask me to volunteer on their campaign. But if you're talking about actual government business, government funding, government policy, government like legislation, regulations, all of that, that is exactly what that account is for. The lawyer's back, so he's going to fact check.
The lawyer's back, and I'd like to point out that the House of Commons is not the government, right? So if you are talking to them about things that you want to influence the government through, then it's fair game. The members remain members until someone succeeds them. Even though Parliament is dissolved, the work of MPs continues. Immigration issues, for example, those kind of files continue to go on. Most MPs, though, will very conspicuously point them to their campaign pages after you engage with them directly on the parl.gc.ca side. So I wouldn't be too hung up on that. But certainly there is an opportunity to find other venues. Like in a Facebook-based election, it is not tough to find another avenue to get to them.
Awesome. Scott, since we have you back, I'm just going to circle back to a couple other questions that came in for you. Dealing with partisanship a little bit more, if you publicly support an ask without spending any money in terms of election activities that is only being promoted by one specific party and not the others, but that ask is very much in line with the clear priorities of your organization, is that partisan?
Don't spend any money, not partisan. It's very, very simple. Now, there's other things that do come up from time to time. So I saw a question there about a staff person who's writing emails and who is, writing press releases. So I turn back to the first part of the test is, why are you doing that? Are you doing it to influence votes? If you're doing it to influence votes, then you may have your third party obligations triggered. If you're doing it because you just want your positions known in the public domain, you're not trying to influence outcomes. So, all of these things are matters which have been considered by judges, sometimes on, with the help of lawyers like me forming those arguments. The materials on the Elections Canada website are very helpful. They have bright line tests of things you can and can't do. And again, it seems to me from the framing of that question is you're doing it to kind of bolster your own reputation as policy experts. You're not doing it for the purpose of influencing an outcome.
And so we've got another question from John Cameron. So he's looking at organizations that registered as third parties in the last election. How onerous was the process to register and report to Elections Canada? So Scott, maybe if you want to lead us off, and then if any other sector actors that were registered as third parties, you're welcome to throw your hand up and let us know what your experiences were. So
I'm a little bit biased because I love paperwork, and I think it's fun. Like, this is what I'm spending my money on. Setting up a bank account, every organization has done that. Getting a resolution from a board of directors, that's really not that hard to do as an organization unless you've got 5,000 board of directors. Having a fixed address, having an accountant, these are things that almost all charities have already, okay? Those accountants, those lawyers, they also like filling in paperwork. Now, if it's Sarah McGee who is forming the, I live in this riding and I hate the MP third party, one person may find this process somewhat daunting and annoying. And then the reporting requirements afterwards. The hardest work is the stuff that happens after the election, when you got to close your bank account, when you've got to show where all your donors' money comes from. That can be a pain. But again, I'm a little bit biased. I don't see it that way. Certainly, the reason we do it is for public accountability and transparency.
Absolutely. Elise, I'm going to come to you for your question, but I just want to leave the floor open if there's any sector folks that wanted to share their own experience with registering as third party, and I'll just leave that open for a second and then we'll go to Elise. All right, Elise, your question, please.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, there's sort of clarification on things that were said. I'm still not entirely clear, like this thing about paying money or not paying money. Again, just to clarify, if you're paying staff to do something, is that paying money or is that not paying money? Or is paying money only when you like buy extra advertisement?
So
yeah, go ahead.
If you are being paid to do your job and your boss says, I need you to go volunteer for someone, that's something that would be captured. Okay. So if you are told to go do partisan things, knock on doors, put up signs, spend your time promoting a position that is going to be closely aligned with one of the political actors, that is something that would be captured. But again, why are you doing the activity? Are you doing it to influence the voter, or are you doing it to influence the discussion? Okay, and if it's to influence the discussion, you will not be captured.
Okay, can I just give you a concrete example? So that Lindsay brought up. Last election, there was one of the parties that said they wanted to cut official development assistance by 25%. Several people in the sector who were registered at charities, not registered as third party, were hesitant to come out publicly against that part of the platform, because we kind of felt, is that would we be partisan, because we would be really criticizing one party above the other. So like if we had put out a press release from or a media manager who's paid to do that work, criticizing the conservatives for that, would that be counted as partisan? If we had sent an email to a member to say, please write a letter to editors, or like contact the MP to say you disagree with that, would that be partisan? So that's the first part of my question. And then if it is partisan, if we had registered as a third party, would we have been free to do that if we only reported it?
So I'll answer your second question first. You're going to have to check with whether or not your purpose allows you, so your charitable status, whether that allows you to do that kind of advocacy. Some do, some don't. Okay. If you register as a third party, you have free wheel, okay, to spend up to $500K coast to coast. I think it's 4,000 per riding. If it's one specific riding, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's adjusted for inflation based on 1927 numbers. So it needs to be updated. Again, the situation that you just described, I think you're not being partisan. I think you are doing your job to represent your sector. Now, if you then turn to all the volunteers or all the paid employees and say, you got to defeat these people and go do the work, that changes it entirely. So now I'm going to completely contradict myself and say, be careful, because there's a difference between the legal definition of partisan, which I can read to you, and the way political actors remember things. So my political advice, as someone who's worked on a couple campaigns and has solicited, the help of third-party groups, is that when you smack someone, they're going to remember. And if you don't smack them hard enough for them to fall down and they're still standing, they're going to remember. So you got to be cagey in how you go out and help. And then this comes back to the, which party is associated with the idea in question. So one of the other questions in the chat is how, what happens if you're trying to advocate for every political party, including the left-leaning libertarians, including the Bloc Québécois? You want them all to do the same thing. Does that turn into partisan activity? The answer is no, it does not. Okay, if you're trying to get the same thing out of everyone and you're not trying to influence votes, it's not partisan.
Awesome. We've got a quick follow-up for Jackie and the caretaker period. So we saw a big announcement from Prime Minister Trudeau coming out of the G7 that committed money to climate action. That money, however, is not in the 2021 budget. Can Global Affairs spend against it, either now before the writ drops or in the election period?
That's a great question. The answer is no. So departments can't spend the money until the money has been allocated to them and passed either through legislation in the House or approved at Treasury Board. This is exactly the kind of thing that the Prime Minister or any Prime Minister, this is not partisan, but any Prime Minister would do in the lead up to a potential election. And then that money, I mark my words, will be re-announced many times during a campaign period with a, you need to vote for me so that we can make sure that this investment is spent and that it's allocated properly, right? So it's a direct political play, and I think it was done intentionally.
I wish we could force the government to spend all the money that's been pledged but hasn't gone through Parliament for allocation. That'd be amazing.
Yeah. The other thing I'll warn you, and certainly you've seen it in your work. The government is infamous for announcing large funds that then get parceled out into multiple small actual spending dollars. So the government will say, this year we're spending, I don't know, $10 billion on climate change in Canada. And when you unpack what that $10 billion is, it's either a number of remarkably small funds spread across the country, or it's a bunch of other line items that have come that have one component that's climate change and one other. Like what they do is they take a bunch of small initiatives and they parcel it together to get a big number that's more impressive and easier to understand. But whenever you see big numbers like that, understand that the allocation of those dollars is never simple. And it's never as large as it seems.
Excellent. We've just got a few minutes left, so I'm just posting a quick survey in the chat. We really want to know what you thought of this session today, how we can make it better in the future. If there are other further questions that you have, please don't hesitate to reach out to me afterwards. But in the meantime, we've got, I think, 17 minutes. So would love to hear thoughts from anyone else in the room. Any other questions? I know there's going to be more. In the meantime, Jackie, I'm going to ask a pointed question just because we know each other from another lifetime. And so you've talked a lot about the sort of importance sometimes of being irritating. And so are there any sort of examples or actions that you think groups on this call could either take at the organizational or the personal level that just get under the skin of a candidate?
Sure. I mean, listen, it's no secret, but it bears repeating, and that is that the squeaky wheel in politics and in government always gets the grease. And the reality is, if you're not talking about your issues, then no one else will, because it's an echo chamber in a vacuum and people are fighting for that space. And so persistence is really key. Message, like repetition, is key. And people are always fascinated or obsessed with trying to find 20 ways to say the same thing. Don't find one way to say it and say it 20 times or 200 times, better yet, because it's repetition that will get you through. I think being present counts for a lot. It's weird. The pandemic has sort of shifted a lot of our understanding about the world, but I really believe that at the end of the day, the world is still run by people who show up. And so simply showing up on your candidate's doorstep, going to campaign events, showing up at their office to talk to them, stopping them at all candidates' meetings to ask them questions. When you know that there's a campaign event or rally, going there to meet the candidate and staying in front of them. I mean, at the end of the day, politicians, for lack of everything, are still human beings, and they connect with people the same way that you do. And staying in front of their face and being present and being repetitious are what works. So just at the point where you've said the same thing so many times that you feel like you can't say it again, that's when it's finally starting to sink in. So keep saying it. And that's, I think, the best way to get through.
So it's interesting that you brought up debates. There are actually rules about debates, which again, like only in Canada, right? Many organizations like to host debates, particularly during an election period. They're either done at a local level where everybody shows up and talks about an issue. So I sit on the board of directors of an organization called Green Pack that does exactly that. They pick ridings and have debates. The one thing I'll warn you about is excluding people. There is an interpretation bulletin that says if you exclude a political actor from that debate, that could be deemed to be a third-party contribution because you're giving a party a platform that you're not giving to everybody else. So be wary about that. Invite more, not less. If the left-handed libertarian candidate shows up, be nice to him or her, but recognize that that person has just as much right to solicit the vote as possible.
Robin, I saw your hand up, but then you disappeared.
Yeah, okay. Quick question. I'd just like to hear from our panelists about, and this is a dilemma I find myself facing all the time. The organization that I work with has, you know, would be a little bit more friendly with politicians probably than I, as like a hardcore activist, might be sometimes. How do you balance those two things? What's like this the strategy there? Anything to be worried about, concerned about? Is it okay to be critical as an individual, and then also sometimes say bravo whenever they do good things from your perspective? Just a bit of comment from our panelists on that, and then yeah, that's all for me.
Jackie, maybe you could hop in and take on that one first.
Scott and I were both just looking at each other. I was like, Scott, did you want to jump in there?
I think that's how you become a candidate, Doctor.
Would you like to run?
Would you like to run? Ask her to run. That's the first and most important thing that you can do.
Yeah, I mean, listen, politics and campaigns are all about ideas, right? I like to think that that's what they are. And I'll say it again, each and every one of us on the call, as citizens of Canada, have not only the right, but I would argue the obligation to get involved in the political process and to talk about the issues that matter. And you should take that right seriously and look for ways to do that.
Anything
I don't know
you want to add there, Scott?
Again, like, everyone is a political actor, and everyone has the right to seek a seat, and everyone has the right to have their voice heard and to collect those voices together. My only advice is that sometimes it's very difficult to divorce one from the other. So I'll give you a very conspicuous example, Mr. DS, right? Like, he's doing his job, but it's tough to separate the union from the Jerry, and just be cognizant of that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just leaving this one open to all of our panelists. Lindsay, was there anything that you wanted to jump in on there?
No, it's so funny. We always actually tell Robin that she should run because she's so engaged. So it was funny. But I think it's important that you're balancing too. Like, your job is part of your life, and the way you are after your job is really important too. And you should be able to talk about the issues you care about. Unfortunately, in a lot of the work we do where we're engaging consistently or meeting with people often, you just need to be cognizant of how it could appear or the ramifications it could have. And just doing a little bit of thinking ahead to think, will this 100% sever a relationship moving forward? And if you're comfortable even taking that risk, then it's something that you think about from a personal perspective as well.
And maybe I'll just add one piece, notwithstanding everything else and your interest in maybe wanting to be a candidate. I'm just joking. But good thing to keep in mind is just never make it partisan, right? Talk about the issues and talk about the issues with anybody who will listen. Seek support and an alliance with anybody who will give you support and alliance. It's not a political, it's not about any one party. It's about doing the right thing for you and for your sector. And so always focus on that and make it not about politics, but about the issues.
Absolutely. We're going to go to Becca and then Rick.
You're going to be treated to 2 MCC questions in a row. So yeah, no, thanks everyone. Jackie, one of your last points made me just think about this group here is we're organizations that a lot of us that do international work, and so things like foreign policy. And you're talking about, I know, and Sarah, I know from talking to you that we're going to have some events later this year to get ready to talk about foreign policy on the agenda. I'm just wondering to hear from you, Jackie, and the others as well, like if you have any advice, further advice for us other than, like, you know, raise our issues, get in their faces as much as we can in the COVID friendly way, and also get those issues and ask the questions. I wonder if you would have more kind of specific advice for us in terms of getting those foreign policy kind of things to the top of the agenda, because often we're fighting to get those on the agenda, and it doesn't usually come up unless somebody asks a question. But yeah, maybe just if you had any comments for that.
Yeah, listen, and certainly that is a tough place to be, because campaigns tend to be slightly more domestically focused, with the exceptions. And again, I say I can think of lots of examples. Maybe the best one will be the 2015 election. And I think we all remember the very real discussion during 2015 about Syrian refugees and Canada's role in welcoming those refugees, and what role we as not just a government, but as a society could play in that conflict. That, I would argue, was one of the ballot box issues of that election. It was so for a lot of reasons, and that's a good example, Scott mentioned it earlier, of the power of the media. And the media in 2015 definitely had a huge role to play on that specific issue. We all remember that photograph. So when we talk about this time around, how to elevate it, one of the things that I would encourage everyone to do is you have to find a way to make your issues personal. So they have to resonate with politicians and with parties on a personal level. And that's either in the case of it aligns with their values or their priorities with respect to their party or their platform, or it aligns with the policies or the priorities of their voters. So remember during a campaign that there are 338 ridings, multiple candidates in each of those ridings. And when you're in a campaign, take aside from the prime minister, everyone else in the campaign is hyper focused on their riding and the votes in their riding and what matters there. So when you talk to MPs, make it personal, make it local. You have to somehow connect it to their voters and their community. And there's ways to think creatively about that. And then in terms of the parties, I think it's being able to align with their values. I mean, listen, there's been a lot of discussions, and certainly I know one of the key themes that Mr. O'Toole and the CPC will bring up in the next campaign is Canada's role in the world, which I won't be too partisan here, but I think it's a bit cheeky for Mr. O'Toole to have that conversation. And if he wants to, I welcome it, because that is exactly what I think everybody on this call would want to talk about. It's Canada's role in the world, our obligations to not just our allies, but our neighbors and our friends from all corners of the world. And so there could be, I do see the political tide changing, and there are already discussions when you look at the G7 meeting recently and the big commitments and talk that came out of the Prime Minister. We finally have a partner down south that's willing to work with us and is pushing our government on issues. Imagine that, they're pushing us on some progressive issues. So I do think that international issues and Canada's role in the world will be bigger this campaign than ever before. So there's an opportunity there. I would take it. I also would, the other advice I would give you is the government, if there's an election this fall, it's for one reason, and that's because the timing works well. So the Liberal government, the Liberal Party, will trigger an election this fall when they think that the vaccine rate in Canada has reached a critical mass, and when they think Canadians are riding on that post-vaccine euphoria. That is the perfect time to capitalize. Right at the top, when I said you have to make your message emotional and play on people's heartstrings and their values, that is exactly the time to talk about the privilege and how blessed we are here in Canada to have had the resources and the means and the access to vaccines and support, economic support through this pandemic. So I do think that this is prime for those issues. Now's the time to talk about them. It's a case of critical mass and just trying to be louder than all the rest. I'm sure opinions on this too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know what the worst time to have an election would be? When kids under 12 who don't have vaccines can't go back to school because of some provincial cluster F. And the only person that the people of Canada are able to blame is the person in front of them at the ballot box, and not necessarily the premier or minister of health that's actually responsible for the problem. So everything that Jackie just said is absolutely correct. And I think the other reason why we are likely to have an election this fall is because some of the economic indicators are going to start going the other way. And there's only so much money that can be printed and handed out in order to achieve those things. So when you're thinking about that, and I mean, you want to talk to multiple political audiences at the same time, start thinking about the economic value that the organizations that you guys represent perpetuate inside the country. And there's actually not a lot of discussion about the economic value of the volunteer sector or the charity sector, but it's real and it's material. And like, if you're worried about staving off future cuts, I mean, that's one way to do it in a very concrete and real way. Like, who filled the gaps for all the people who did not have a paycheck in March of 2020? It was your sector.
One thing I'd add too, just from the sector perspective, that I think it's really important, is we oftentimes have trouble as a sector sorting out how we're going to educate Canadians on these international issues. And I think if anything helped, it's been this global pandemic where the entire world is experiencing, obviously at different levels of privilege and social protection and infrastructure. We're at this point now where people understand their kids are home at school, we're locked down. Countries around the world have been affected by this. So if there was ever an election where we could probably tie some of our issues and make something really enticing and memorable and emotional, I think this is the time to do it. So being bold and just, in a way, making sure that we're aligning that with this global pandemic that's going on, I think it's really crucial.
Absolutely. We're going to go to Rick, and then I have one final question in the chat to bring us into the end of our panel today.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be quick. Jackie, I wanted to thank you for an intervention that now is about 3 ago, because you've said a number of other important things since that, as have the other panelists. But I was a little concerned that I at least was feeling a little chill throughout parts of this conversation about, well, how can we speak to our issues without being seen or being partisan? And something you said was, you know, be free to speak to your issues, speak broadly across the political spectrum. And I wanted to first thank you for that, and then just double check that I heard you right, because that was an anti-chill message, which I found very encouraging.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and I understand why, and certainly during normal times, like I understand if you have limited resources, especially government relation resources in your organization, you'll go to the government first because they have direct control over the outcomes, what you're looking for, the money, the programs, the regulations, you have to go there. But particularly now in the pre-writ period and during a campaign, talk to all parties. So if you don't have relationships right now with the opposition, go introduce yourself. Make sure they understand your issues. You'll be surprised too, if you've never met with them, about how receptive they are. They're really, in a pre-writ period, little sponges, just looking to soak up information and understand issues. So they'll actually be more open and receptive than I think you would expect them to be. So now's actually a great time to talk to all parties and make sure that you're just equal about it, especially during a campaign. Don't presume any sort of outcomes. If you, for example, are sending questionnaires to candidates, make sure you send it to all, to Scott's point, all the candidates in the riding. There might be 8 or 9 from parties you've never heard of. That's okay. Send it to them too. Support is support. And the more voices you have that in support and alliance with your priorities, the better.
And let me tell you, the main parties have really good polling. So if the left-leaning libertarians pick up your issue and they notice it on their polling tracker, you can be sure that they're going to pick it up and make it their own. Just because they didn't come up with it doesn't mean it's not a good idea. They'll steal it. And anyway, the last thing I want to say, Rick, is like you nailed it. This should be about empowerment. We have third-party spending rules to ensure the playing field is as level as possible so that people don't outspend one another. But ultimately, third-party spending is the manifestation of free speech and free assembly and participating in democracy. It's not a bad word. We should talk about it. We should be out there speaking these things. So think of it in constitutional terms. These are the rules for exercising your rights.
Excellent. So our last question, I really like it. I think it's a fantastic way to bring our conversation full circle. Question for the women on the panel. I'd love to know how you balance the need to make things personal, recognizing that the personal is the political, with the need to honor and manage your own emotional labor as well. And I know that not all of you can directly speak to this, as you may not identify as BIPOC or women of color. How do you navigate that need to uplift voices of BIPOC or women of color without speaking over them on personal issues and without placing the burden of emotional labor on these people who are directly and systemically impacted by these issues and carrying the mental load of dealing with them? It's a big one to end on.
So I can maybe start to unpack parts of it. I think especially in the role that all of us play in the sector is oftentimes it's just consistent things that we're trying to work towards and bigger things. So it can be really heavy, but I think that's where it's important to set professional and work boundaries and really have an understanding of what you're doing, what you're comfortable with, and talking to those around you, using your support systems, your family, your friends. I obviously have a lot of privilege in the position I am. And so when we're talking about elevating BIPOC issues, I think it's really about providing space, providing narrative, working with others, recognizing maybe when you are not welcome in a space too is actually a really critical component. I think it's also working with, not working for. That just critical mindset change is understanding that the more conversations we have with a diverse group of people, and the more kind of perspectives we're bringing into a conversation, the better outcome we're all going to have, the better understanding we're all going to have. And it's what's going to create a more diverse conversation and lead to better and more impactful change in issues. So I know that's kind of a lot to say, but it is a really important question. And I think especially in the space right now, it's really important for everybody to take the time that they need. The pandemic's been stressful for everyone in a lot of different ways. And so I think it's about just also reflecting a lot on how you feel, what you're thinking about, and the work you're doing.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, that is, it is a heavy load to carry. And I want to acknowledge that politics can be scary, it can be intimidating. I mean, they call it the political arena, which has so many different connotations and imagery associated with it. As a woman in politics, I've gone into battle that I did not want to many, many times. And so I know the toll that it can take. And I would say, to echo Lindsay, you need to set boundaries for yourself in terms of what you're comfortable with and where you're willing to go and where you're not. And then seek strength in numbers and look to build others up around you. So look to empower those around you and help provide a path to give them voice and a role to play as well. And so I do believe that politics is a team sport. It's inclusive, right? It's about a collective of voices and people. And it's incumbent on all of us to find a way to ensure safe spaces where people feel like they can tell their story in their own truths in their own voice. And I think whatever we can do to help create those spaces and give people an opportunity to say that, the better the conversation will be. But I will also end on I think a positive note. And as difficult as the conversations could be, there's never been a better time to have them. And I think those voices are growing in power and in number every single day. I say it's about time. I'm so thankful that people are starting to question the traditional power structures and roles, not just in government and politics, but in society. And so I think whatever we can do to support one another and each other and encourage, and even if it's just all you feel comfortable is talking to your colleague or your friend one at a time or just one time about those things, I think it's important to do that too.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for your attendance and participation today. I know we've gone a few minutes over, but I hope it was for a good cause. I think that last question was too important to skip. But tomorrow the forum's going to continue with the Cooperation Canada AGM, and I hope that everyone has a chance to connect through the day. And thank you so much to our panelists, your advice, your wisdom. It's given me a lot to think about, and I think that you've definitely sparked some thought across the sector, and I'm really excited to see where all of our conversations go from here. And I'm really excited to continue down our own election readiness path. So again, thank you all so much. If you do have a moment, please fill out the survey. We always want to get better at this. And please have a wonderful rest of your day.